USA versus Russia. Let's get started. Point 1. Total area. USA, 9.83 million square kilometers. Russia, 17.10 million square kilometers. Point 2. Population. USA, approximately 347 million. Russia, approximately 144 million. Point 3. Nominal GDP. USA, about 31 trillion US dollars. Russia, about 2.3 trillion US dollars. Point 4. GDP per capita. USA, about 89,000 US dollars. Russia, about 16,000 US dollars. Point 5. GDP PPP. USA, about 31 trillion US dollars. Russia, about 7.5 trillion US dollars. Point 6. Military spending. USA, about 1 trillion US dollars. Russia, about 150 billion US dollars. Point 7. Active military personnel. USA, about 1.3 million. Russia, about 1.1 million. Point 8. Reserve military personnel. USA, about 800,000. Russia, about 1.5 million. Point 9. Nuclear warheads. USA, about 5,200. Russia, about 5,500. Point 10. Aircraft carriers. USA, 11. Russia, 1. Point 11. Military aircraft. USA, about 13,000. Russia, about 4,300. Point 12. Fighter aircraft. USA, about 2,700. Russia, about 800. Point 13. Helicopters. USA, about 5,400. Russia, about 1,500. Point 14. Tanks. USA, about 4,600. Russia, about 5,700. Point 15. Naval fleet. USA, about 480 ships. Russia, about 420 ships. Point 16. Submarines. USA, 68. Russia, 64. Point 17. Coastline. USA, about 19,900 kilometers. Russia, about 37,700 kilometers. Point 18. Road network. USA, about 6.8 million kilometers. Russia, about 1.5 million kilometers. Point 19. Railway network. USA, about 148,000 kilometers. Russia, about 85,000 kilometers. Point 20. Airports. USA, about 19,600. Russia, about 1,200. Point 21. Internet users. USA, about 331 million. Russia, about 130 million. Point 22. Smartphone users. USA, about 310 million. Russia, about 110 million. Point 23. Electricity generation. USA, about 4,500 terawatt-hours. Russia, about 1,200 terawatt-hours. Point 24. Oil production. USA, about 22 million barrels per day. Russia, about 10 million barrels per day. Point 25. Natural gas production. USA, about 1,030 billion cubic meters. Russia, about 590 billion cubic meters. Point 26. Gold reserves. USA, about 8,133 tons. Russia, about 2,300 tons. Point 27. Foreign exchange reserves. USA, about 250 billion US dollars. Russia, about 680 billion US dollars. Point 28. Stock market value. USA, more than 60 trillion US dollars. Russia, less than 1 trillion US dollars. Point 29. Billionaires. USA, about 900. Russia, about 140. Point 30. Fortune Global 500 companies. USA, more than 130. Russia, about 2. Point 31. Exports. USA, about 2.1 trillion US dollars. Russia, about 430 billion US dollars. Point 32. Imports. USA about 3.4 trillion US dollars. Russia about 300 billion US dollars. Point 33. Largest city. USA New York City about 8.5 million people. Russia Moscow about 13 million people. Point 34. Nobel Prize winners. USA more than 400. Russia more than 30. Point 35. Top universities. USA more than 50. Russia more than 5. Point 36. Research and development spending. USA about 900 billion US dollars. Russia about 50 billion US dollars. Point 37. Number of billion-dollar companies. USA more than 2,000. Russia around 100. Point 38. Olympic gold medals. USA more than 1,100. Russia more than 590. Point 39. Total Olympic medals. USA more than 3,000. Russia more than 1,500. Point 40. FIFA Men's World Cup titles. USA 0. Russia 0. Point 41. FIFA Women's World Cup titles. USA 4. Russia 0. Point 42. UNESCO World Heritage Sites. USA 26. Russia 33. Point 43. Forest area. USA about 310 million hectares. Russia about 815 million hectares. Point 44. Longest river. USA Missouri River about 3,767 kilometers. Russia Lena River about 4,400 kilometers. Point 45. Carbon emissions. USA about 5 billion tons. Russia about 1.8 billion tons. Point 46. Life expectancy. USA about 79 years. Russia about 73 years. Point 47. Highest mountain. USA Denali 6,190 meters. Russia Mount Elbrus 5,642 meters. Point 48. International tourist arrivals. USA about 66 million. Russia about 25 million. Point 49. English speakers. USA very high. Point 50. Time zones. USA 6 time zones. Russia 11 time zones. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this USA versus Russia comparison, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to DD Compare, and turn on notifications for more exciting data comparison videos. See you in the next video.